Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, if you do enjoy the video that you came here to watch, do me a favor, go ahead and hit that little red subscribe button at the bottom of the screen. It really does help my audience grow. It really does help this channel grow. It means more than you realize. So go ahead, hit that little red button. Also, remember, full episodes of the Aaron Torres Podcast, wherever you download your podcast, Apple, Spotify, etc. Now, here is the video that you came here for.
With that said, I do want to get to the topic of the day. And the topic of the day, as I just said, we could start in any number of places. We could start with Georgia, Tennessee. We could start with Clemson. But I want to start with Bama, LSU. Bama goes to LSU. Bama loses again. And as I just said a moment ago, I do think this Alabama program is at a fascinating crossroads. Doesn't mean the dynasty is dead, but things are going in the wrong direction. And by the way, LSU fans, for those of you listening, this is not an indictment on you. You guys are awesome. Brian Kelly is awesome. Brian Kelly is ahead of schedule. But I say it all the time on the show. The more interesting story is often in the losing locker room. And while there are two interesting stories coming out of this game, I do think the more interesting story is with Alabama. So let's get with Alabama. And what I'm not going to do over the next 10 minutes is break down this game play for play for play for play for play. Because at the end of the day, this was the Alabama that we have seen for 2 years. And what I think is disappointing about the effort itself, this was the week that it was supposed to get right? I mean, last year it's up and down, up and down, up and down. They come into this season. You think they put all that behind them. Struggle at Texas, struggle at Arkansas, struggle against A&M, lose to Tennessee. Now you're still in the playoff picture. You're at number 6 in the first poll. You're coming off a bye. Nobody is better than Nick Saban with time to prepare. And what happened Saturday in Baton Rouge? Well, let's be honest. It was the same Alabama performance on Saturday that we've essentially seen in every big road game for the last 2 years. If I had described Saturday at LSU, what would you, as an Alabama fan, describe it as? Lost opportunities early, no really explosive plays offensively, too many mental mistakes, letting an inferior team, and even LSU fans would admit that this year under Brian Kelly in a rebuilding year, that team on the other sideline did not have equal talent. Letting an inferior team stay in the game, too many big plays on defense, confusion on defense, too many penalties. This is who Alabama is. This is who they've been for 2 years now. And so you get to the fourth quarter, Bryce Young does his magical Bryce Young things, and all of a sudden you look like you have a chance to win late. Bryce Young makes an incredible play. You go up, LSU scores. Alabama kicks a field goal to send it to overtime. And then in overtime, even when you score, what happens? LSU, one play in the end zone, and then credit to Brian Big, Kelly goes for 2, gets 2, and Alabama loses 32-31 against LSU. And so again, we're going to talk about LSU in a minute. This was an incredible night, and I hope every LSU fan embraced and cherished and enjoyed every moment. But to me, the more interesting story is Alabama, because again, I know that as fans, nobody wants to do the whole Alabama's dynasty is dead. And that is not what I am going to do today. But what I will do today is say this. At this point, we have a 2-year trend that something is not right with this program. And so my question becomes, what is wrong? How does it get fixed? And what is the next era for Alabama? First of all, to go back to that point, a 2-year trend, I think there's some people that maybe aren't diehard Alabama fans or diehard college football fans that would sit there and say, Torres, you're overreacting. They have 2 losses, but, how are you going to say that things are going in the wrong direction? Well, it's pretty straightforward. The facts tell us that. First off, in their last 8 games going back to last year, okay, here are the results. They are 5-3 overall in their last 8 games. Tell me any stretch in the Nick Saban era where you could say that they're 5-3 under any circumstances, any conditions ever, yet when they leave Tuscaloosa, they are a different team. 5-3 in their last 8 road games dating back to last year. And even in the wins, they're not the same Bama. 2-point win last year against Florida. 2-point win in 4 overtimes against Auburn, 1-point win at Texas this year, and now 2 losses on the road this year to go along with the loss at A&M last year. And so don't tell me they're the same team. They're 5-3. They're not as dominant on the road. I think the term that, Alabama fans used through the years was joyless murder ball, in which they basically came into your stadium and ripped your heart out. That ain't who Alabama is anymore. And frankly, it is not who they have been for a very long time. And so when I look at Alabama and I try to diagnose what is wrong, why are they not the same? By the way, I saw this stat, blew me away. How about this? First time since 2010 that this team has more than one loss prior to Thanksgiving. 2010, the last time they had more than one loss prior to Thanksgiving. So things are going into the wrong direction. And to me, I think it speaks to 2 things. What are the problems and how do they get fixed? How did we get here? How did this happen? I think in terms of the problems, what I would say is what stands out to me about this Alabama team, there is no one problem, right? And that to me is the most stunning part of all this. You think about most other teams. You could sit there and say, well, this is the issue. Tennessee, it's the secondary, it's the defense, good but not elite. USC, it's definitely the defense. Ohio State doesn't appear to have a run game right now. Michigan, do they have the explosive athletes that they need to beat the elite teams? Can they do anything other than run the ball right at you? With Alabama, I kind of just listed it. It's everything. The players don't seem to have a killer instinct. I don't think the coaches put them in the best position. And so you look at, by the way, 2 penalized, too many turnovers, all that good stuff. It's not just one thing. And so again, what I want to talk about now is really 2 things. How did we get here? How does it get fixed? Because when I just think about this Alabama situation, I think it's clear. Other people are catching up. I'm not saying they can never win again under Nick Saban, but this year is lost. They have 2 losses. It is not going to get better. Right now, they don't even control their own destiny in the SEC West. They need LSU to lose to either Arkansas or A&M, or they're not even going to the SEC championship game. So I started hearing on Saturday night into Sunday morning, well, what happens if this? Well, what about that? Well, what if they go to the SEC championship game and beat Georgia? They need help to even get to the SEC championship game, and that's assuming that they don't lose again before the end of the regular season. And by the way, they play Ole Miss next week, and I don't feel super confident that they're going to take care of business against Ole Miss. So what has gone wrong? When I think about the situation in Alabama, 3 things stand out. Well, really 4 things have stand out as to why things just aren't right with Alabama. 1, I do think some of this is on the players. And I know they're young and we don't like to blame 18, 19-year-old kids. I get all that. But here's the bottom line. You can't say that Alabama doesn't have talent. Every single year, every single one of these recruiting classes was a top 2 recruiting class nationally. Now, last year they were number 2 behind Texas A&M. But the year before, they were the number 1 recruiting class in the country. Multiple number 1 classes, multiple top 2 classes. You can't say it's not talent. So it's something between the ears. It's something going on in practice, in preparation. And I do think that's part of it. I think from the opposite perspective, I do think other schools feel like they're starting to catch up. Now, not everybody is ultimately going to catch up. Not everybody's going to beat Georgia, get to a national championship game and beat Alabama. But at the same time, something that I keep thinking about, think about Nick Saban kind of built this blueprint, built this culture for all of these years. And I sit there and say, think about how many people got a piece of Nick Saban's playbook right now. And I'm not talking about his literal playbook. I'm talking about the metaphorical playbook, how to build an organization, how to build an infrastructure, how to kind of have that triangle that all leads towards the top. Think about everybody that has been on the inside at Alabama over the last decade and has access to what Nick Saban has done and brought it somewhere else. Kirby Smart's obviously the best example, right? Kirby Smart has basically built Bama Part 2 in Athens, and they might be better than Alabama right now. Billy Napier at Florida. I don't know if it's going to work, if it's not, but he was there for several years. He knows how to build an organization. Whether it results into wins on Saturdays, I don't know, but we're going to find out. Mario Cristobal at Miami. Don't know if it'll work, but we're going to find out. Steve Sarkisian coming to the SEC in a few years. Don't know if it'll work, but we'll find out. Lane Kiffin at Ole Miss. Mel Tucker at Michigan State. So you go on. And where I think it's important, not only do those guys have your metaphorical playbook, But on top of that, I also think something else. Those guys are now going head to head with you in recruiting. And so you look at recruiting across the board. Listen, I still think Alabama probably has the most talented roster in college football. If they're not number one, they're definitely number two. But when I look at Alabama, one thing stands out to me. Who is the hottest coach in recruiting right now? It's Mario Cristobal, whether he should be or not. They're getting a lot of players that Alabama wanted. Georgia's recruiting at an elite level. A&M is recruiting at an elite level. So I don't know that they're getting the volume of players that they once did. I was on Sirius XM on Sunday morning with Andy Staples and Barrett Sallee, and Andy Staples brought up the interesting point of like most of the dudes that were on the field for Georgia that were ripping Tennessee's heart out, they were in Alabama's top 3, and Georgia is now ending up with those guys. So I know I'm going in a lot of different directions, but I'm trying to diagnose what's going on with Alabama. One, they've lost a lot of good coaches. Those coaches have taken the blueprint other places. And then on top of that, and I do think this is important, I do think the changes in college football are impacting it, where they're not recruiting the volume of players that they once did. They're going to other schools. I do think the transfer portal is a factor as well. Alabama lost 20 players from the transfer portal since the end of last season. Now, all of them weren't impact players, and some of them were replaced by other good players. But I do think that depth that was once there isn't there. I don't think the gap from 1 to 85 is as big as it was. But I'll be honest, if I could diagnose Alabama's problems right now, if I could say one particular thing, I'll be perfectly honest. Do you know what I think it is? I think Nick Saban whiffed on not one, but 2 coordinator hires. And it's so interesting, right? Because one thing about Alabama and Nick Saban, he gets credit for a lot of things, being the greatest recruiter ever, the greatest winner ever, the greatest talent, evaluator ever, whatever. What I don't think Nick Saban gets enough credit for is how he has developed coaches, found coaches, and the staffs that he has surrounded himself with. I think the famous story, which I know I've tweeted out, but the 2016 national title staff, Lane Kiffin at OC, Kirby Smart at DC, Mario Cristobal is the offensive line coach, Mel Tucker's the defensive backs coach, Billy Napier is the wide receivers coach, Dan Lanning, who's now the Oregon head coach, was a GA on that team. I think I'm probably missing something. But when you look at Nick Saban, one of his greatest strengths is his ability to identify and develop coaches within his system. And you look at this team compared to previous teams, it just ain't clicking from the coaching perspective. And so I do think if I had to blame 2 people more than anybody, it's probably Bill O'Brien, the offensive coordinator, and Dan Lanning, the defensive coordinator. Not Dan Lanning, Pete Golding, the defensive coordinator. I apologize. But I bring it up because you look at this offense. Think about the offense right now. They are if they have even average quarterback play, they're probably 5-4 this year. People say, oh, they're two plays away from being undefeated. They're 2 plays away from being 5-4. And Bryce Young absolutely carried them in the Texas game that they won. Now, he didn't play against A&M, but he absolutely carried them in the Texas A&M game. And so I look at this situation in Alabama, I think it falls on the coordinators. Bill O'Brien just isn't good enough, especially, by the way, when you look at the fact that he followed Lane Kiffin and Steve Sarkisian. And Steve Sarkisian, you look at what he's done with that offense at Texas, it's unbelievable. From the defensive perspective, again, I'm not X's and O's guy. I'm not scheme guy. But what I am is a guy with 2 of these. And for those of you not watching on YouTube, I'm pointing at my eyeballs. It's not good enough. They don't look prepared. They don't look disciplined. One, the penalties speak for themselves. I mean, the penalties speak for themselves. Another 9 penalties on Saturday night. This remains, in terms of penalties per game, one of the most penalized teams in all of college football. This is a team that cannot get off the field because they shoot themselves in the foot. Most of it is discipline, all sorts of stuff like that. By the way, last in the SEC, 125th nationally in penalties, okay? So they look undisciplined. They look confused. Tennessee, they look completely lost. The last play in the LSU game, they looked lost. And so to me, that's really what it boils down to. I think some's the players. I think some is that other coaches have Nick Saban's blueprint. And I think some is that they've lost a lot of really good players either through the portal or in recruiting in recent years. But the talent is good enough to not be losing to this particular LSU team. But to me, it comes down to what I just said. It comes down to, I don't think Nick Saban has done well in developing and evaluating these two particular coordinators. And I think if we want to talk about getting things fixed, if we want to talk about, is Bama ever going to be a title contending team again? I do think this is where it starts. And I don't have the answers as to who would fix things. But the one thing that I think Nick Saban has done better than anything, it's obviously, develop coaches. But the other thing that he does really well, he is a great, you talk to people in football, he is a great self-scouter. In other words, he looks at his team, he looks at their strengths, their weaknesses, and he figures out, how do we get better? How do we get better? How do we fix things? How do we get back on track that we need to? And so I look at this situation. I think it's going to be an interesting couple weeks coming out of this season. I think it's going to be an interesting couple weeks as he evaluates the offense. How can it get better? How can they have an identity? How can they better take advantage of all their players? But then the defense as well, because it's just not good enough with Pete Golding. So I don't want to get to the LSU perspective right now, but I got to say, man, you talk about just a disappointing effort from Alabama and Nick Saban. And I'm telling you, man, I know we just went in a lot of different directions, but I think there is a lot to peel back from Alabama's perspective.